If you're an art lover or a French Revolution lover, you probably know this painting. Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Marat. Painted in 1793, it portrays French revolutionary leader Jean-Paul Marat after being assassinated in his bathtub. I like this painting, even though I always thought that Marat's body was lying in a very unnatural position. However, even if you're not a fan of the arts or French revolutionary history, there's a chance you know this painting another way. There's a chance you know it as the Deathconsciousness album. Or the Have a Nice Life album. Either way. Deathconsciousness by Have a Nice Life was released in 2008. It was initially all but ignored by the music press, but due to word of mouth and the power of internet forums, namely 4chan's Mew image board, it became a cult classic in the underground music world. I've encountered many memes about this album in my day. I'm far from the first person to talk about this album. Two videos I particularly like are by Noise OS and Duncan Clark. However, I couldn't resist the urge to make one myself, even if it is kinda low-hanging fruit. This video doesn't really have a thesis. I'm pretty much just gonna talk about the things I like about this album, the songs, the other stuff, and just the background behind it. Hopefully I make it good enough to justify this video's existence. With that out of the way, let's cut to the chase. Have a Nice Life was formed at the turn of the new millennium, which is a pretentious way of saying the year 2000. They originated in Middletown, Connecticut. This makes them the most famous people to come out of Connecticut since, any of these guys. Oh, and Mellon himself. The duo consists of Dan Barrett and Tim Macuga. In terms of their prior musical history, Dan was a singer with the hardcore band In Pieces, while Tim played with the ska hardcore group Danger Strangers. In an interview on the duo's early days, Tim said, "Our earliest endeavors revolved around making college coffeehouse sorts uncomfortable. There was a basement show phase as well. However, once we got into home recording, we became shut-ins. For a while, it seemed like the group was treated as basically a side project while the two worked on other bands, based on the rather sporadic nature of their early releases." As far as releases go, there were early demos that didn't see a proper distribution. In an interview with Rate Your Music, Dan says that their early material was very new wave. They ditched this sound when reactions to it weren't positive, to say the least. They self-released their first official demo, Have a Nice Life vs. You, in 2002. I won't spend too much time on it since that's not what this video is about. I'll say that it's definitely interesting. There aren't any drums on the album, just acoustic guitar and vocals. It does leave you yearning for more at points, but overall it's very well written. It has a nice indie folk vibe to it. Their next demo, Powers of 10, would be put out in 2006, although I couldn't find it online. The track listing on Rate Your Music says that the songs on it are early versions of the tracks that would later appear on Deathconsciousness, so presumably I'm not missing much. On the 24th of January 2008, the group put out Deathconsciousness on their own record label, Enemies List Home Recordings. The album took about 5 years to record, according to both Wikipedia and Rate Your Music. The duo worked on a budget of less than $1,000, and the gear they have listed on Bandcamp lists such high-tech equipment as a laptop, a USB recording interface, and various musical instruments. I should probably take a quick second just to explain what genre Deathconsciousness is. Wikipedia lists 5 genres, but I don't want to explain all of them since that would just result in a jumble of buzzwords. Genres I think are the most accurate are post-punk and shoegaze. Post-punk, since there's a very stripped-down feel to a lot of the songs with a touch of experimentation, and shoegaze because a lot of it feels very overwhelming, like the sound is enveloping you. Many dreamlike sections. There's also a solid amount of industrial influence to the album, with pounding programmed drums, and the songs are also quite long, not usually following a traditional song structure. The main word I'll use to describe this album is bleak. Their location was an influence on their music, with Tim saying, "Broadly speaking, our sense of place is a huge factor. New England is private, cold, gray, wooded, and full of roads that follow old sheep-herding paths. Very little symmetry. Sure, cities and retail suburbs here and there, But overall, there are definitely more places you can go where nobody will bother you. One other quick thing I wanted to add is that there isn't really much information as to who played what on the album. Bandcamp and Discogs, both usually the best sources for finding out this kind of stuff, both give basically nothing. Dan did all the vocals and all the drums were programmed instead of actually played on a kit, but aside from that, not really much info. The two of them have a few references in interviews to one or the other playing a specific instrument on a certain track, so my assumption is that the two of them traded off on instruments depending on who wrote what. The album is a behemoth 85 minutes long and is split into two sides. The first side, The Plow That Broke the Plains, opens with the nearly 8-minute, a quick one before the eternal worm devours Connecticut. As an instrumental, not counting the barely audible vocal sample at the end, the song is centered around two harmonizing acoustic guitar tracks and various layers of ambient-sounding synthesizers. The guitar is barely changing throughout the song, and the synth lines are very simplistic, and yet, while listening, I never found myself bored. It has that sort of hypnotic quality. The guitar riff on this song was actually sampled on Shiver by Lil Peep. You know you've made it when that happens. According to Tim, he recorded the guitar part in his bathtub for the reverb. After hearing this track, you might feel a little excited or anxious what the rest of the album holds. Then you're hit with the next song, a little ditty called Bloodhail. This is my favorite song on the record. It hits you right in the face with a gritty sounding bass line that repeats throughout the entire song, along with the bare bones but effective drum line. The tone on the bass is one that I've been trying to replicate for a while. When asked about the bass during a Reddit AMA, Dan said, "Tim wrote the bass line, but he couldn't play it very well. I looped it, but it's off time, which gives it its weird, stumbling quality. The distorted guitar plays a simple line, and it adds perfectly to the atmosphere. The overall vibe to the song, I feel, is nihilistic, but hopeful, if that makes sense. Dan Barrett's vocals are heard properly for the first time, and they sound amazing. He layers two vocal tracks, and the effect is heavenly. There's a section in the middle of the song where Dan starts repeating the word arrowheads, and when they play it live, the audience all chants along with him. The lyrics discuss witnessing horrible events while not really caring, trying to find meaning in the suffering that surrounds oneself, and attempting to kill God by building a staircase out of human bodies and hurling arrowheads up at heaven. Overall, this song is one of the few that I would describe as truly flawless. The next song up is The Big Gloom. It starts out with distorted guitar chords that sound almost like a fan whirring, and Barrett's vocals eventually kick in. When the drums and bass eventually start, the instruments all sound overpowering, like a wall of sound. The digital synths that eventually come on act as a nice contrast to the harsh nature of the other instruments. Towards the end, things quiet down almost completely aside from one sparse, clean guitar line. The lyrics reference the 1990s psychological thriller Jacob's Ladder, specifically a scene in which the main character is forced into an ice bath. They take this image and discuss the idea of being in one while contemplating suicide, with later lyrics expressing a desire for death. This is Dan's favorite song on the album. The nearly 10-minute Hunter is next. It starts out with a programmed drum line and a really dirty-sounding distorted guitar. The vocals come on, and after about a minute and a half, there's a really peaceful-sounding lead guitar line. This is sort of a motif, and it repeats for a bit. About 2/3 of the way in, things get considerably louder, both drums and guitar. There are more layered synths at this point, playing different melodies. Like The Big Gloom, it sounds overwhelming at this point. It does eventually quiet down close to the end. The lyrics of the song continue the narrative started in Bloodhail. In this song story, God accepts defeat after being killed by the arrows hurled at him by the titular Hunter, and allows humanity to use his skin and bones as tools and clothing. God also laments the violent nature of humans and how the Hunter has taken his place as the subject of worship by the world. Telephony is the shortest song on the album up to this point, a little over 4.5 minutes, and it's very quiet and relaxed. The programmed drum beat is just a kick and snare, and there's a barely audible guitar line, and Barrett's vocals sound distant. Just a very basic song. This song's lyric discuss building a time-traveling telephone to contact a deceased loved one. The final lyric, when the world hates a body, it just throws itself away to a place where our hands can't reach. It's kind of interesting to me. Genius says that it means we do not solve our problems long term, but only delay their effects. Whatever you say. Who would leave their son out in the sun starts out with digital strings that sound quite pretty, and I didn't really expect to hear those on this record. Very nice. Dan Barrett's vocals soon kick in to remind you that you're still listening to a Have a Nice Life song. The guitar work on this song is quite nice, even though all it is just strummed chords, like that at a campfire. The song kind of reminds me of early Chelsea Wolfe. According to Genius, the title is a reference to God sending his only begotten son to be crucified for humanity's sins. The lyrics discuss biblical denials of Christ and heresy in general. There Is No Food is only 4 minutes long, but it's a good 4 minutes. It starts out with electronic beeping, beep, boop, boop, bop, boop, boop, beep, and distorted guitar sounds soon kick in, along with gentle acoustic chords. This continues until the end when the instruments cut out and there are a few echo-heavy boom sounds. According to Tim, who largely completed the song by himself while Dan was doing taekwondo, the duo thought they had captured ghost sounds on the recording at first. However, what they actually captured was Dan's roommate laughing while in the kitchen of the apartment they were recording. Also, while Genius claims the lyrics are Tim reciting a poem, the exact words are unconfirmed, and the heavily reverb nature of the vocals makes deciphering them nearly impossible. And that finishes the first side. In between the sides of the album, I want to do a quick interlude talking about the album cover, a little more than what I mentioned in the cold open. This might be a small detail, but I like the filter they put over the painting. In addition to cropping it, it really gloomifies it, if that's a word. When asked why they chose the painting for the album, Dan said, "Because I thought it looked cool mostly. Man of many words." This cover, I think, might have played a role in helping the album get as popular as it did. A good album cover has to be eye-catching, and this certainly is. Part of that is due to just how bare it is. Some of the best album covers out there are pretty sparse, but that can work very well. It forces you to try and guess what the album's going to be, and the only way to know if your guess is accurate is to give it a listen. If you were browsing forums online and saw someone post this, you'd probably think to yourself, what is this album? The cover's just a zoomed-in bit of a painting. I'm curious. I can't actually prove that this was the case, but more importantly, you can't prove that it wasn't. Back to the music. The album's second side, The Future, begins with waiting for black metal records to come into mail. The first minute of the song is just a stretched out ambient chord.
See, the longer the note, the more dread.
Until some programmed drums kick in. The guitar plays a surprisingly upbeat rhythm line. Barrett's vocals are mixed pretty quietly, but it's an effect I kinda dig. It sounds surprisingly conventional, and it's a welcome break from how crushingly down the album as a whole can be. The lyrics for this album are a little less clear than the others, but there are references to our knowledge of the universe changing, and powerful governments and corporations exploiting the populace. Holy fucking shit 40,000 has muted electronic beeps, while Dan sings over a soft acoustic guitar. Some beautiful keys kick in, and it sounds very pretty. About halfway through, the drums turn pounding, and the guitars turn distorted and blaring. Towards the end, things get quiet again, though, with soft acoustic guitar. The lyrics discuss our lack of free will, as well as the idea of human hearts being replaced by machine ones. Sure, it might be able to work just fine, but there's just something missing. The title is probably a reference to the tabletop game Warhammer 40,000, which I have never played because even I have my nerd limits. At under 4 minutes, The Future is the shortest song on the album, and according to Spotify, the least popular. It combines electronic beeping with minimalist drums and guitar volume swells, amongst other strange sound effects. It's basically all there is to this one. There are no lyrics. Deep has pounding drums and a sweet, gritty bass line. This too sounds a little more like a conventional rock song. Barrett's vocals sound like he recorded them in a large room with the acoustics. There are also sweeping synth sounds that really add a lot. The lyrics discuss the destructive nature of human procreation, and also include some good old-fashioned asking God why things suck so much.
Lighten up, Francis.
I Don't Love has guitars with heavy echo effects, and it almost swallows you up. There are also really cool synthesizers on this one. There are lyrics, according to Genius, but they're sung in a way that makes them almost impossible to understand. This feels like a shoegaze song, and it's very dreamy at points. Some songs have lyrics that are open to interpretation. This one doesn't. The lyrics are very blatantly about depression. The closing track, the 11.5-minute Earthmover starts with singing and soft strummed guitar, although there are soon pounding drums, distortion, and a minimalist keyboard line. After a bit, things get quiet again, although halfway through the noise returns and it feels cathartic. The bass drop towards the end of the song was a spontaneous studio improvisation. That's a fancy way of saying that Tim got frustrated when recording the bass and threw it to the ground. Speaking of Tim, this is apparently his favorite song on the record. This is a perfect song to have as an album closer. Makes you both want to headbang and close your eyes in meditation. The lyrics describe massive earthen golems destroying humanity, only to find that since nothing on Earth can kill them, they have no purpose in life now except to just wander the Earth in perpetual misery. And there's the album for you. If all this release had to offer was good music, this would still be an album with a lot to talk about. As that happens, it offers a little something else, too. There's one thing about Deathconsciousness that I haven't mentioned up to this point. If you bought a physical copy, be it on CD or vinyl, it would come with a 70-page booklet written by Dan Barrett. It discusses the life and teachings of fictional cult leader Antiochus. According to Wikipedia, there are numerous ancient figures with that name, but none of them led any cool cults, so this fictitious guy has the leg up on them. I hadn't read the booklet before doing this video, but here's my best summary of what it says. Before we get to the actual story, there are 4 separate quotes that start things off. There's an excerpt from The Books of Terror and Longing, Book 2, Section 9, a fictional work that I'll touch on later. I am base, and I am lever. I push the earth into the water. Whosoever lives, so shall they die, and may they die a drowning death, with all of life inside their mouths, and naught but stones inside their lungs, like David with the skull, dwelling upon it in every second, the impossible trials of seizing, stopping, ending. Then there's the booklet's official preface, discussing the inevitability of death and how prevalent of a role it's played in human history. It discusses the millions who died in the Black Death, saying, "Not a single one of those dead men, women, children, fathers, mothers, lovers, or friends knew that their death was simply one part of the greatest culling of the human race ever known, the simple mark in the ones column for the greatest disaster in history. Death has a belt and he notches it just once, no matter who you are. Not one of those people appreciated the big picture, the great number, over the extinguishing of their life, their loves, their woes and memories and happinesses. Not one of them saw it for what it was. They only saw the sores on their limbs, the milky white in their eyes, the blood in their spit and urine." All in all, the preface says, almost all of the death that occurs in the world is meaningless. Those who die are but statistics. Then there's the quote, "This is death consciousness, and it begs the question, what is the point?" Finally, there's a foreword written by a professor of religious history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, whose name has been blacked out. Claiming that the band contacted them to write this booklet, they, going gender neutral because there's no name to work with, discuss their excitement at being able to write about a figure who is still rumored to have not actually existed by many people. They end by saying, "If it were you that had disappeared unknown into history, you would want someone to try and remember you. You would want someone to try and understand. So that's what I'll do." I should once again reiterate that this booklet is a work of fiction. This professor does not exist. With that, we can finally begin to talk about the life and teachings of Antiochus. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to refer to him as if he actually did exist. Despite Antiochus's works, particularly his Books of Terror and Longing, having been the subject of many books, being mentioned by none other than Aleister Crowley, he remains practically unknown outside of academia. Most of this can be due to his works being somewhat incomplete. In addition, the nihilistic, dark nature of his works means that most people aren't going to want to read them more than once. As far as his life goes, historians aren't sure of Antiochus's exact date of birth. The earliest record of his existence dates to 1215 in what is now Italy. He left home at an early age, moving to Rome, and his parents would receive scant references in his future works, a familial disconnect that academics believe might have influenced his philosophy. There aren't many stories of his youth outside of a myth in which he prophesies the death of many villagers that historians believe to have been made up. The city of Rome had a significant influence on Antiochus, as he was overwhelmed by the sheer amount of human presence there, yet he could also tell that it was a society doomed to fall. He was soon expelled from Rome after suspicion of being involved in a woman's death, and this experience is suspected to have influenced his views on the city as a whole. When he finally returned 25 years later, he was a changed man, carrying with him a high amount of prophetic zeal. Not much is known of what happened to him during his period of exile, but it's suspected he had some sort of traumatic experience. He's known to have spent time in the Caucasus region with a group of ethnic Armenians, and certain connections have been made between him and an Armenian folktale of a prophet who spoke to crows, but nothing is known for certain. Upon returning to Rome, Antiochus began preaching in the streets. Rather than yelling aimlessly into crowds, he would pull people aside, correctly guess their names, and explain that God had told him who they were. This method gained him many followers. The teachings of Antiochus became more and more clear and solidified. He claimed that, instead of good and evil, the two forces in this world are negation and life. Life is represented by reason and is constantly bringing new ideas into the world. Negation is exactly what it sounds like. As Antiochus pointed out, it's easier to destroy than to create. And so while the universe might seem to be imbalanced, it is in fact tipped towards negation. Eventually, there will be a great negation in which the universe will be overcome by death, and the very concept of being will cease to exist. Antiochus became the target of persecution by the Roman government after his supposed involvement in the death of a woman named Marisa Giovan during one of his and his followers' rituals. Those present claimed that she committed suicide by cutting her own throat. Faced with a lack of evidence, Roman authorities simply beat Antiochus, crushed his right hand, permanently crippling it, and sent him off. Shortly after this, the first Acide Occulto took place, a series of seemingly random murders of upper-class Roman citizens. When an Antiochian found himself under suspicion, the Romans decided to arrest Antiochus. Not able to find him, they instead began heavily persecuting his followers. The Antiochians were deemed a dangerous cult and viewed as boogeymen by many. This period of persecution is known as the Years of Lead and Ash. In 1254, Antiochus was finally captured and promptly burned at the stake. His followers, no longer safe in Rome, were forced to flee, and most eventually settled in the Caucasus region in what is now Armenia and Azerbaijan. For fear of being found out, most Antiochians refused to write down their religious beliefs, meaning that most academic records on the religion are simply transcriptions of oral history. Priests developed a series of mysteries and rites meant to keep the religion ongoing, although Antiochianism was eventually dealt a blow by the rise of Gnarlism. Gnarl was a man who claimed that the spirit of Antiochus had spoken to him, declaring that he was to be the next leader of the church, and that he should exterminate all those who went against him. He was able to gather a sizable amount of followers and carried out a series of massacres against those who didn't believe him. Gnarl and his followers were eventually defeated in battle, with him being executed and his bones ground into bread. Later, however, many would follow his ideas in secret. This eventually led to the discontinuing of the mysteries, the modern-day effect being that Antiochianism is barely known at all by the populace. Eventually, an Englishman named William Shelley would travel to the Caucasus region and record the oral histories of the religion in the Books of Terror and Longing. And it's mostly due to this that many of those who know about the religion know about it at all. The book sold terribly, but of the few who read and understood it, they wouldn't soon forget it.
This booklet perfectly ties into the album's themes of nihilism and provides a backdrop for the music. Another thing I haven't mentioned so far is that several of the lyrics on the album directly tie into the story of Antiochus.
Bloodhail references Antiochian lectures by bringing up images of torn clothes, gnashed teeth, and arrowheads. The Big Gloom references Antiochus responding to a question of what happens when we die. Hunter is a thematic sequel to Bloodhail, as mentioned before, and has the same references. The unintelligible vocals on There Is No Food are suspected by Reddit user Black Widow 1949 to be a reading of the Gnarlist prophecy. It's not necessary to read the booklet along with listening to the album, but it definitely helps in my experience.
When asked about the booklet and overall themes in an interview with Rate Your Music, Dan said, I'm gonna have to really cut down this quote here.
World building helps me conceive the record as being done and to picture it in my head as a complete physical piece. It's more motivating for me to actually get it done, which can be useful because it takes me a long time to write. When I was in school, I liked playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? I've got a book on inventing fake languages. I just like that sense of layout, an environment for people to play in and make connections in. I like rewarding people who really want to do the deep dive and really want to dig in and look for all the weird little Easter eggs. I used to love going through the liner notes of a record and really looking at all the people and different bands that they mentioned. It is really fun to put in a little work to provide something for those fans. I like making little zines or putting stuff together through writing.
As I've said before, the initial response to this album was pretty quiet. It didn't chart, although for an album like this, that's basically a given. One of the few outlets to give it much praise was Sputnik Music, with Nick Greer giving it a 4.5 out of 5, would eventually make their top 100 albums of the decade list, with Greer writing,
"Overdriven guitars and brittle snare drums define a soundscape that treads the line between despair and hope. Waterlogged vocals bounce off these instrumentals like a choir in an empty church. Pick scrapes and vocal inhales are interwoven with riffs and beats. Yes, Deathconsciousness is rough-hewn, but it's also earth-moving. As positive an appraisal as that would be, it wouldn't be all that the album would get in the coming years."
The album received a cult following that many releases of its sort could only dream of.
The continual popularity of the album has led to it being repressed on vinyl 17 times, thanks in large part to record label The Flenser picking up the record after it was released. Rate Your Music has just under 36,000 ratings for it, with an average score of 4.1 out of 5, a grade that would translate to a B- if it were a high school essay.
Of course, if you were in Canada, it would be an A-, but enough about grading systems. Speaking of Rate Your Music, check out these descriptors: depressive, misanthropic, self-hatred, sad, alienation, and apathetic. The Spotify listens for this album are impressive too. The two most popular songs, Eternal Worm and Bloodhail, have over 30 million listens each, with every other song having at least 2 million. With albums of this type that have gotten popular largely through a cult following, it can be difficult to measure their popularity. Of course, the best way to measure any media's impact is to look at the memes that have been made about it. With that in mind, here are the funniest results that came up when I googled Deathconsciousness memes.
Have a Nice Life did not call it quits after the release of Deathconsciousness. After taking a break for Dan and Tim to focus on other projects, during which Dan released a self-titled album under the name Giles Corey, they released The Unnatural World in 2014, followed by Sea of Worry in 2019. Both of these albums received positive reviews, although they haven't achieved anywhere near the same status as Deathconsciousness.
Frankly, given how incredible its success was, the fact that they were unable to catch lightning in a bottle twice musically is hardly surprising, as good as their other albums are. So there you have it. For an album made with almost no money by two depressed dudes from Connecticut, Deathconsciousness has ascended to the status of certified internet classic. I've quoted the duo's interview with Scene Point Blank multiple times throughout this video. In that interview, which was shortly after the album's release, one was just slowly starting to gain steam but not yet at the status it would eventually gain, Dan said this about the album:
"We would have written the exact same record if we were the last two people on Earth. It was recorded assuming that no one would ever hear it. If anyone ever does and they enjoy it, that's great. I hope that happens. But that's about as far as it goes."
Indeed, a lot of people did enjoy it, and it was great. Now that I've done a fair bit of talking, I want you to do a fair bit of listening. Go listen to the album, be it on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or whatever. I prefer you to listen to it in one go, but if you have to listen to it in bits, that's okay too. If you like it, then great, you have another piece of music to add to your rotation. If not, hey, at least you tried something new. If you're still watching by now, I want to say thank you so much for giving me your time. If you like what you saw, be sure to like and hit subscribe. I make videos whenever I can. I always have a ton of fun making them. Hopefully you have as much fun watching them. If you have an idea for a topic you want me to cover, leave it down in the comments. Who knows, maybe I'll get to it. I'm Robbie J2734. I will see you when I see you next.